They froze. 14 barking hounds circled the women like a noose made of fur and teeth. Dust kicked up from their boots, a growl to the left, a snap to the right. The dogs weren't leashed, and for a group of Japanese auxiliary women, nurses, clerks, some barely out of girlhood, every instinct screamed the same word: run. But none of them moved, not even when the largest hound lunged. It wasn't the guards who stopped the chaos. It wasn't an order from the Americans that cut through the barking. It was what the women did next. Something so strange, so unexpected, that the Cowboys, seasoned Texas ranchers turned military handlers, stood in stunned silence. This was supposed to be intimidation. These dogs were trained to break spirits. Instead, what they witnessed was a quiet defiance, a gesture so steeped in contradiction that it made even the dogs hesitate. What happened next would ripple through the camp for weeks. The wind kicked up dust that stuck to their calves and cheeks as they stepped from the transport trucks. 37 women, most of them in battered khaki skirts and blouses that had once passed as uniforms, now faded by salt air and sun. They had crossed an ocean without knowing their destination, but now they stood beneath a flat, burning Texas sky, ringed in silence and suspicion. Beyond the barbed wire, nothing moved. A crow cried out somewhere in the distance. Then, from behind the mess hall, the dogs appeared. 14 of them, large, lean, and fast. German shepherds, bloodhounds, Dobermans, the kind used to track prisoners or drive cattle. They poured across the yard like a shadow breaking into pieces. Their barks cracked open the silence. The handlers, men in dusty uniforms and weathered hats, stepped back and let the hounds close the distance. It was a drill, maybe, or a warning. No one said a word. The women, fresh off the ship, still dehydrated and stiff from the journey, stopped walking. The dogs circled. Camp Wainwright was one of the lesser-known POW sites in the American South. A converted cavalry post with long rows of barracks, a mess hall, and a few makeshift training yards. It had seen German prisoners by the hundreds, many of whom were marched in from the Atlantic ports. But this was different. These were women. Japanese auxiliaries captured in the waning days of the Pacific War, nurses, radio operators, even 2 civilian translators. Most were in their late teens or early 20s. Some wore shoes, others sandals made from ship canvas. Their arrival had been unexpected, their presence quietly controversial. The guards had been briefed. No photographs, no press. The women were not to be touched unless they tried to escape. No one really knew what to make of them. And so the commandant, a career officer with a fondness for silence and cigar smoke, had given a private order: show them the hounds. Let the girls see what waits if they try to run. The dog handlers, mostly Southern men recruited from ranches and farms, had no love for the Japanese. Many had lost cousins or brothers in the Philippines. The dogs had been trained on German prisoners, but the men were eager to see how the women would react. "Don't get too close," one of them muttered. "These ones'll scatter like quail." But the women didn't scatter. At first they froze, breath shallow, eyes darting. The dogs circled closer, teeth bared, barking sharp. One hound lunged at the outer edge of the group, barking into the face of a woman no older than 20. She did not scream. She took a step back, then another, not away from the group, but into it. Another followed, then another. In the span of 10 heartbeats, the formation shifted. They linked arms. The movement was instinctive, almost ritualistic, a soft shuffling of feet, a turning inward. The older women moved to the edges. The younger ones were drawn into the center. No one spoke. They did not cry. They did not pray aloud. They simply stood, a silent, linked ring, their backs to the dogs, their faces turned toward each other. From the watchtower, one soldier exhaled a low whistle. "What in the hell?" The handlers barked orders at the dogs, but the hounds hesitated. The formation threw them off. These weren't prey running, they weren't aggressors, they were something else. The lead shepherd paced back and forth, tail stiff. Another sat, ears twitching. A few kept barking, but the edge had dulled. Something had cracked in the scene, not just the discipline of the dogs, but the assumptions of the men watching. It wasn't defiance, not exactly, and it wasn't surrender either. It was something harder to name. Composure, maybe. Training of a different kind. Cultural or emotional armor that refused to break under threat. They had been taught that capture was worse than death, and yet here they stood, surrounded by barking teeth, unmoved. A few of the guards looked to their commander, but he gave no order to stop. The dogs stayed, the circle held. Minutes passed like hours. Sweat ran down the women's necks, dust clung to their lashes. The silence of the circle grew louder than the barking. Finally, a single bark snapped the tension. A handler whistled. The hounds began to retreat. The test, or whatever it was meant to be, ended, but the effect did not. The women said nothing. They simply stood until the last dog disappeared around the corner of the barracks. Then, without breaking the circle, they turned to face the guards. Not with anger, not with fear, just presence. And the cowboys, for the first time in months, had nothing to say. No one moved. Not the guards, not the dogs, not the women. The wind dragged across the yard, carrying the smell of iron soil and animal sweat, but inside that motion there was a pocket of absolute quiet, as if the air itself was holding its breath. The women remained linked, their arms locked tightly enough that their sleeves creaked. The youngest among them, a girl no older than 19, stood at the center with her eyes closed, her lips barely moving as though she were reciting something only she could hear. Not a prayer exactly, more like a memory. This formation had not been taught in any military manual. No American drill sergeant had ever studied it. It was older than that. A reflex pulled from a culture that had drilled into them the idea that fear should be internal and discipline external. In their training camps back home, they had learned that to lose control was worse than to lose one's life. Panic was weakness. A scream was an admission of collapse. If chaos came, you shaped it with stillness. If death approached, you faced it without spectacle. So they stood, arms interlocked, shoulders squared, not looking at the dogs, not giving them the reaction they had been conditioned to seek. The handlers began shouting commands, sharp and impatient. They waved their hands, snapped fingers, issued orders through clenched teeth. The hounds obeyed mechanically, turning, circling again, trying to provoke movement. A bloodhound strained against its lowered head, confused by the lack of flight. These dogs were trained to read fear through motion, through breath, through sudden shifts. Stillness was foreign to them. It had no scent. It offered no reward. One of the younger handlers, a rancher's son from western Oklahoma, lowered his voice without realizing it. "They ain't reacting," he said, almost as if speaking louder might crack something sacred. Another shifted his chewing tobacco and spat into the dust, never taking his eyes off the circle. "Ain't never seen nothing like this," he muttered. For a moment, authority slipped from their hands, not dramatically, not with conflict, just subtly, like sand through fingers. Here they were, men trained to control bodies and terrain, suddenly confronted with something they could not command: voluntary stillness. A few guards on the perimeter exchanged looks, not angry, not impressed either. Something closer to disorientation. They had seen panic before. They had seen it in young Germans captured in Normandy, in Italian units surrendering in clusters, in deserters near the end of the European front. Panic was familiar. Panic made sense. Signs of animal fear simplified the enemy. But this was different. One guard, an older man who had survived 2 tours in the Pacific, removed his cap slowly. He had seen what Japanese training did to its soldiers, the fanatic charges, the refusal to surrender, the final, desperate moments. But this was not fanaticism. This felt quieter, more controlled, more internal. "They're shielding the little ones," he murmured to no one in particular. And it was true. The outer ring of women adjusted slightly, turning their bodies just enough so their shoulders formed a barrier around the center. When one dog growled and lunged forward again, a taller woman shifted instinctively, blocking its line. But she did not flinch. Her jaw trembled, but she didn't let her arm break. Inside the circle, the girl opened her eyes. She did not look at the dogs. She looked up at the sky, where a thin cloud drifted like torn paper across the sun. Her breath came slow, measured, each inhale deliberate, each exhale controlled. She was doing what she had been taught to do in hospital tents back home when shells landed too close and patients began to panic. Slow the air, stabilize the center. The eerie part was this: the dogs felt it. Animals sense disorder. They chase disorder. But when confronted with symmetry, with silence, with something calm enough to mirror, they hesitate. The lead shepherd stepped backward slightly. Another whined softly. It was not fear, but confusion. The sound of an instinct meeting something unnatural. The yard fell quiet. Even the buzzing insects seemed to recede. For several long seconds, or perhaps minutes, no one spoke. No one knew how. The stillness had swallowed command. Then one of the older handlers raised his hand. "Call 'em off," he said, his voice steady but altered, like he had crossed into someone else's tone. The dogs were whistled back. One by one, they broke their circle, trotting reluctantly toward their masters, looking back over their shoulders as if they, too, were unsure what had just transpired. The women did not move right away. They remained linked, making sure the last ripple of dust had settled, making sure the air had returned. Only then did their shoulders relax, barely. Their hands never unclasped. They simply waited. And none of the men watching could decide which had unsettled them more: the dogs, trained for violence, or the women, trained for silence. 2 weeks earlier, the ocean had been everything. A wall of gray stretching so far in every direction it made even memory feel distant. The women had been herded onto the ship in silence, no explanation, no goodbyes. The hold smelled of diesel, rust, and salt. Most didn't know where they were going, only that they were no longer going home. A few had guessed correctly. "America," one whispered. The word felt like poison in the mouth. For them, it was not a place. It was a punishment. And everything they'd been told insisted that to be captured by the Americans was to lose more than freedom. It was to lose honor, dignity, the right to live without shame. This belief hadn't come from nowhere. It had been drilled into them from the first day of training. The Bushido Code, once the province of samurai, had trickled into every corner of military and civilian life. Death before surrender wasn't just a motto. It was law. Officers reinforced it in daily drills. Mothers whispered it at night. Surrender was a stain that would reach your family, your ancestors, your unborn children. If you could still draw breath, you were expected to fight. And if you could no longer fight, you were expected to die. On the ship, those ideas began to unravel, not through argument but through starvation. The women were given rations, but they were thin, stale, and slow to come. The journey lasted over 3 weeks, with stops in the Marshall Islands and Pearl Harbor. No one told them the final destination. The bunks were stacked metal slabs. Some women vomited constantly, too sick to even crawl to the latrine buckets. Others began to ration their own spit, sucking on rags to keep their mouths moist. The heat inside the hold made the air thick and cruel. One girl, the youngest among them, collapsed and did not wake for almost an entire day. When an American medic came to check her pulse, the others flinched, expecting a blow. But the man simply nodded, set down a cup of water, and left. They didn't understand it. That was the first crack. They had expected to be stripped, starved, maybe even paraded. But there were no jeers, no soldiers laughing in their faces, just orders, barked in a language they didn't speak, and the long, endless horizon. That alone became disorienting. If the enemy wasn't cruel in the way they'd been taught, what were they? When the ship docked in San Diego, they were not told the city's name. They were marched onto buses with curt commands. Some tried to see through the slats. They glimpsed houses with porches, school children in uniforms, trees heavy with fruit. No smoke, no rubble, no signs of war. But it wasn't until the convoy passed a field, green, so bright it seemed almost artificial, that something inside them cracked open. A field, grass stretching for miles dotted with cows and windmills, a house in the distance with laundry swaying on a line. The girl who'd collapsed earlier sat up, slightly, her eyes hollow but alert. "It's not a prison," she whispered, though no one answered. Still, they waited for the catch. Surely the camps would be different. When they finally arrived at Camp Wainwright, the gates didn't look like cages. They looked like a ranch. The barbed wire was neat. The guard towers manned, yes, but quiet. The dogs hadn't been loosed yet. That would come later. For now, the guards called roll. One by one, names were mispronounced, faces studied, uniforms catalogued. Then the order, disembark, line up, move. They obeyed without question. Not because they were broken, but because they were conserving strength. Every moment of their lives since capture had been about endurance. Survival without appearing weak. That, too, they had been taught. But the silence that followed their arrival was not the silence of threat. It was something stranger. The guards didn't yell. The sun was high. Somewhere, someone was grilling meat, and the smell was so familiar, so achingly normal, it made one of the women choke on her breath. This wasn't what they were told. The land was quiet. The air smelled like grass and smoke, not blood and gunpowder. And beneath it all, the question began to grow, slow and dangerous. If this is America, then what else did they lie to us about? The question hung in the air long after the dogs had been called off, long after the dust had settled and the hounds had vanished behind the mess hall. For the women, it was a whisper inside the chest, a tremor beneath the ribs. For the men watching, it was something heavier, something that clung to them like sweat under a wool uniform. They had not planned for quiet. They had not planned for dignity. They had planned for movement, for panic, for confirmation of every story they had been fed about the enemy across the ocean. The hounds had been more than animals. They were tools, techniques borrowed from battlefield psychology, used first in Europe, then adapted for camps like this one. The idea was simple. Break the will early. Use fear to create submission. A growling throat, a snapping jaw, a circling body. These things worked better than fists. They bypassed logic and went straight to instinct. The dogs were not meant to bite, not unless someone tried to run, They were meant to remind the prisoners what could happen, what power looked like, who held it. That was the plan. But a plan only works if the other side plays their part. When the women stood still, when their arms linked and their breathing slowed instead of quickened, the entire structure of the moment shifted. The dogs had been trained to dominate fear, not composure. The handlers had trained for breakage, not discipline. In one quiet formation, the women had refused the script. And that refusal didn't just challenge the dogs, it challenged the men holding the leashes. After the drill ended, the yard shifted back into routine. The women were ordered toward the barracks, their steps measured, their eyes lowered, but their shoulders still held with a strange tension, a remnant of standing together too long. The guards returned to their posts. The dogs were kennelled. The dust returned to its normal quiet. But the moment did not leave. Down by the equipment shed, a few of the handlers gathered, resting their weight against a wooden beam. Sweat ran down their backs. One lit a cigarette, inhaling slowly like he was trying to slow his heart back to a normal rate. "Well, that didn't go as planned," one muttered. Another shook his head, pulling off his cap. "They didn't even flinch." "They should have," a third added. "Anybody should have." But the oldest among them, a man with lines etched into his face from years under open skies, didn't speak right away. He had grown up breaking horses. He knew the difference between panic and control. He knew when an animal's spirit had been broken and when it had simply been containing itself. He chewed on that thought for a long moment. "They ain't scared," he said finally. "They're trained." The word unsettled them. Trained for what? Death, endurance, obedience? The question sat unspoken, but each man felt it. Because what they had just witnessed was not stubbornness. It was not defiance in the loud sense. It was internal discipline, the kind that doesn't shout, the kind that stands. Later that evening, near the mess line, 2 guards watched the women shuffle forward for their first full meal: stew, bread, and black coffee that smelled like burnt earth. Most of the women avoided eye contact. A few stared at their hands like they were objects that no longer belonged to them. But not one of them complained. Not one of them rushed. The calm had followed them indoors. "You ever seen anything like that before?" the younger guard asked. His companion shook his head slowly. "Not in Europe. Not anywhere." He hesitated, then added something he hadn't expected to say out loud. "Kinda makes you think, don't it?" "About what?" "About what they're made of." The dog demonstration had been meant as a lesson to the prisoners, but it had become a lesson for the guards, too. A quiet reversal, a shift in perspective too small to announce, but too large to forget. That night, as the women lay on their narrow bunks, staring at the wooden ceiling, the memory replayed itself. The barking, the dust, the silence. Some of them now trembled, not from fear of what had happened, but from the delayed release of it. When adrenaline fades, it leaves space for shaking, for small, private cracks. Yet none of them spoke of panic. Instead, one whispered, barely audible across the dim barracks, "We did what we were taught." No one answered her. But a few heads turned slightly in the dark. A few breaths slowed. Outside, a guard walked the perimeter with his rifle slung loosely, boots crunching along the gravel. He passed the kennel at the back of the yard. The dogs were lying down now, silent, their bodies curled into tired shapes. He stopped for a moment, listening to the crickets hum beneath the Texas night. "They got nerves," he murmured under his breath, not sure who he was talking about anymore. And the word that none of them had planned to use, the one that had no place in a prison camp, began to rise among the men like tobacco smoke after a long pause. Respect. That night, the women were moved into canvas barracks lined in tidy rows, framed by gravel paths and a single overhead bulb that buzzed like a wasp in a jar. Inside, the bunks were narrow, the mattresses thin, but they were real. Folded neatly at the foot of each cot lay a wool blanket, stiff with starch. For women who had slept on ship floors and cell walls, it might as well have been velvet. No one said thank you, no one dared. But when the mess bell rang and they were handed bowls of beef stew with soft bread on the side, something inside them began to crack, not from comfort, but from contradiction. They were not supposed to be treated this way, not after capture, not by the enemy. The stew was hot and oily, the bread strangely sweet. A few women hesitated before touching it, suspicious. Others began to eat quickly, shoulders hunched, as if afraid someone might take the food back. But the guards didn't shout. No one laughed. The room echoed only with the sounds of spoons scraping bowls and quiet chewing. Later, when they climbed into their bunks, the women wrapped the blankets around their legs, slowly, like testing a foreign fabric. In the dark, some began to cry, not from gratitude, but from guilt. This warmth, this food, this quiet, it didn't match the image they had carried of the enemy. And more than that, it didn't match the reality of how they had been treated by their own officers. In the final weeks before surrender, food had been withheld as punishment. They'd been forced to march barefoot across coral beds, told to stay silent as comrades died in their arms. One girl, Hannah, had been struck across the face by her commanding officer for requesting extra gauze for a dying soldier. The bruise had only just begun to fade when the American medic handed her a clean bandage without being asked. This kindness, or something like it, was not part of the war they knew. That afternoon, a guard passed out Hershey bars. A few women held the brown rectangles without opening them. One sniffed hers and began to weep softly. The sweetness brought back the memory of childhood, of things not made from rice husks or powdered roots. She ate it in tiny bites. Another tucked hers away, hiding it in her boot. Later that evening, paper and pencils were offered. The women were told, with slow, simple English and pointed gestures, that they could write letters. Home, Japan, 1 page. They were even told the letters would be sent. Skepticism flooded the room like smoke. Still, one by one, they sat at wooden tables and stared at the paper. Some trembled, others clenched their jaws. Words were difficult, not because of language, but because of disbelief. What could they possibly say? That they were alive? That they were warm? That the Americans fed them and gave them soap? Eventually they began to write. "My feet are no longer blistered," one wrote. "We sleep indoors," wrote another. "I have not been touched," said a third. And one, in careful characters that leaned like reeds in the wind, wrote, "The enemy feeds me. The dogs did not bite." Those letters were handed in silently. Some were intercepted. Others, astonishingly, made it home. Japanese censors read them with furrowed brows, unsure what to make of the narratives. Too gentle, too strange, too dangerous to be allowed. In the days to come, more letters would follow. And while none of the women knew whether their families would ever read them, they wrote anyway. Because writing meant they were still human, still individuals, not war machines, not forgotten ghosts, not shameful statistics, but people, wrapped in blankets, holding pencils, trying to understand how survival could feel so much like betrayal. 3 mornings after the drill, as the camp resumed its usual rhythm of mess calls, perimeter checks, and quiet, watchful order, a sound drifted into the compound that didn't belong. It was a whistle, Low, casual, the kind of tune a man might hum while fixing fence posts or riding a horse through open country. It curved through the wire fence like smoke, catching on the air, not loud, but distinct enough to turn heads. The women stepped from their barracks for morning roll call, shoulders squared and hair combed as best they could manage with shared tools. It was then that they noticed the source of the sound. A guard leaned against the outer fence, tall and tan, the brim of his hat pulled low. He didn't stand like a soldier. He stood like a rancher, one boot hitched up on the bottom rung, arms folded with a kind of quiet ease. And beside him, sitting patiently in the dirt, was a dog. Not one of the barking hounds from the drill. This one looked older, slower, its coat dusted in white around the muzzle. One ear flopped sideways. Its eyes were the warm, tired kind you find on animals that have worked more than they've rested. The women noticed the absence of a leash, the absence of tension. The dog was calm, still, unthreatening in a way that felt almost out of place in a prisoner-of-war camp. Some guards watched from a distance, unsure whether to interrupt or observe. The young handler beside the dog made no move to explain himself. His name was Levi, a rancher's son from Abilene, and the dog, Buster, had once herded cattle through Texas heat so blistering it melted boot soles. Buster wasn't here for intimidation. He wasn't here for show. He was just there. And then one of the women stepped forward. It was the same woman who had taken the center during the dog drill. She moved without fanfare, her expression unreadable. She walked slowly to the edge of the wire, knelt with precision, and extended her hand, palm up, bare, waiting. No food, no command. Just stillness. Buster tilted his head. He approached in a slow shuffle, paused to sniff the air, then stepped forward again until his nose was just inches from her hand. He gave a single, deliberate lick, then sat, tail thumping once against the dirt. Levi blinked. He'd seen Buster herd bulls, challenge coyotes, snarl at drunk ranch hands who came too close, but he had never seen the dog greet a stranger with that kind of gentle curiosity, let alone someone who lived behind wire. Something passed between them, dog and prisoner, not in words or signals, but in a kind of shared recognition. By the next morning, Buster was back, and so was the woman. This time others joined her, 2, then 3. They didn't crowd the fence. They stood at a respectful distance, letting Buster come as he pleased. One brought a small crust of bread, another simply watched. No one reached to pet him, but every movement was careful, intentional. The dog, for his part, moved with quiet dignity, accepting what was offered and giving nothing more than his presence in return. Inside the barracks, word spread. A dog had licked her hand. A real dog, not a military hound. A dog who listened, who chose stillness. The story grew in whispers, not exaggerations. They didn't need to embellish. The facts were strange enough to stand on their own. In the guard shed, the tone shifted too. The men spoke differently now, not dramatically, but with a slight tempering. Conversations started with, "Did you see what happened?" instead of commands. The dogs in the kennels seemed quieter, as if even they had sensed the ripple that moment created. Some of the younger guards laughed it off. Others simply stared at the fence when they passed, their expressions unreadable. Buster became more than a dog. He became a symbol, not of power, not of control, but of choice. He wasn't trained for fear. He didn't operate on violence. He showed up because he wanted to, and in doing so reminded everyone, on both sides of the wire, that even in a place built on rules and ranks, softness could still appear without permission. And when it did, it demanded nothing, yet changed everything. The morning the drills ended arrived like any other. Clear sky, clipped orders, footsteps crunching gravel in practiced rhythms. But something essential had gone missing. No barking echoed across the yard. No handlers marched with taut leashes. No command broke the morning stillness. The dogs stayed caged, their presence reduced to distant rustles in the kennels behind the barracks. No one explained it, and no one needed to. The silence was louder than any announcement. The commanding officer did not speak of it publicly, nor did he write an official order. He simply watched from a shaded spot near the edge of the compound, hands folded behind his back, his gaze fixed not on the women, nor the guards, but on a strip of bare earth near the drill yard. That's where it had happened. That's where the women had stood, unflinching, unmoved, eyes closed and hands linked, as 14 trained hounds barked, bared teeth, and waited for panic that never came. The officer had expected fear. What he got instead was stillness, so absolute it reverberated through the entire command structure. In the end, it wasn't strategy that retired the drill. It was the quiet failure of fear. The dogs were walked later that week, but only in the outer perimeter and under different handlers. They didn't return to the demonstration yard. Over time, their kennels were moved farther from the barracks, and though their barking could still be heard faintly at night, it no longer punctuated the women's routines like a threat. The drill had died, not with a bang, but with a blink. The guards noticed the shift, even if they didn't talk about it at first. Then, slowly, the stories started to form, short, muttered, and often second-hand. "Did you hear about the drill?" someone asked in the mess hall. "The one with the girls?" The tale mutated as it traveled. Some said the women hadn't blinked. Others swore the dogs had whimpered first. One version claimed the officer had called the whole thing off in embarrassment. Another said the dogs sat down of their own accord. But the phrase that stuck, the phrase that cemented the event into camp legend, was simple and sharp, passed from one pair of lips to the next like a secret. The girls stood still, and the dogs blinked first. It was said with a kind of reverence, the way you might talk about a gun misfiring in a duel. Not everyone believed it, but everyone repeated it. Even those who hadn't been there began to view the women differently. Conversations shifted. The tone softened. Orders became more measured. There was still discipline, but it came with fewer slurs and less contempt. A kind of restrained curiosity replaced the old suspicion. Guards, who once looked through the women, now looked at them, noticed the way they tended the sick, shared food, repaired torn sleeves with threads pulled from unraveling blankets. They were no longer just foreign. They were familiar in ways that unsettled the rigid. Lines of war. In the quiet hours after lights out, guards sat by the perimeter smoking hand-rolled cigarettes and talking in low voices. Sometimes they spoke about the drill, not as a tactic gone wrong, but as a ghost story. Something strange, something powerful. "You ever seen a person freeze a dog with a look?" one would say. "No," came the answer, "but I saw 14 women freeze a whole camp." That was the story now. And once a story like that takes hold, there's no going back to the way things were. The ground near the mess hall wasn't much to look at, flat, dry, beaten down by boots and sun. A stretch of dirt that had, until then, served no purpose beyond separating barracks from food. But one morning, without warning or fanfare, a guard appeared at roll call with something unexpected in his hand. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a clipboard. It was a crinkled brown paper envelope, creased at the corners, edges soft from handling. He didn't make a speech. He didn't even make eye contact. He simply held it out to the closest woman and said, "See if you can make these grow." Inside were seeds, beans mostly, a few squash, maybe tomatoes, though the packet had no label, just a faint red stamp and a drawing of a sun. At first, no one moved. They had been trained, by war, by loss, by silence, not to trust gestures without clear intent. But that evening, as the air cooled and shadows stretched long across the yard, 3 women stepped into that dusty strip of earth and knelt. They didn't ask permission. They didn't announce their purpose. They just knelt, hands in the dirt, fingers searching for soft spots between the gravel. Others watched from a distance, and the dogs, once instruments of fear, watched too, stretched out along the fence line, tongues lolling, their barks replaced by the occasional lazy grunt. It wasn't gardening, not yet. It was something smaller, slower. A ritual of defiance wrapped in stillness. The act of placing life into soil that had never been asked to hold anything. By the end of the week, more women joined. Someone fashioned a crude trowel from a broken spoon. Another woman used twine from a supply crate to mark rows. The work was quiet. No singing, no chatter, just the sound of hands brushing dust, of dry earth parting beneath determination. And the dogs? They came closer. One in particular, an old brindle hound known for his sharp teeth and sharper temper, began lying in the sun not 10 feet from the gardeners. At first, the women tensed. He had once growled when they passed him too quickly, but now his eyes fluttered closed, his legs twitching slightly as if chasing rabbits in a dream. One morning, he rolled onto his back and yawned, a full display of belly and trust. No one dared touch him, but they planted near him, and he never moved. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone, not the women, not the guards, not even the officers, who occasionally paused their walks to glance toward the small plot of green now pushing up through brown. It was more than food, more than occupation. It was reclamation. The war had taken so much, names, futures, homes, but here, in a patch of dry Texas dust, something new was beginning to grow. Not as a metaphor, but as a real, visible truth. The women, too, were changing. They still marched, still answered to numbers, still slept beneath canvas and wire. But their posture shifted, their eyes lingered longer on the sky. They brushed their hair more often, smoothed their collars before meals, acts that would seem small in any other setting, but here they were profound. They were no longer warriors captured by the enemy. They were women surviving with intention. They were caretakers of life, even in a place built to remind them of death. And that garden became more than a garden. It became a place where past and present didn't fight each other, where memory and healing could grow side by side, where a seed dropped into broken earth could bloom into something no command had authorized and no manual could explain. Like this story so far? Hit the like button and leave a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. The repatriation orders came quietly, as most things did in Camp Bartlett. A clipboard was passed, a list read softly under breath, and a few women were told to prepare. The war had ended months before, but now, at last, the paper trail caught up with the human one. A handful of prisoners, those with surviving family, those deemed fit to travel, would be put on a transport headed west, then east, then further east still, across an ocean none of them had seen in years. One of the women, young, soft-voiced, but steady, sat cross-legged on her cot the night before departure. Her name was Haruka. She had been a radio operator once. Quick hands, quick mind. She was not quick now. Everything about her moved with care, as if sudden motion might erase the strange balance she'd learned to live inside. In front of her sat a square of paper, smoothed at the corners from being folded and refolded so many times it had the texture of linen. She did not write immediately. First she sketched. The pencil in her hand was short, worn nearly to the eraser. She began with the dog, large head, lazy eyes, one ear flopped sideways. It was not a perfect likeness, but close enough to be known by anyone who had seen him. Then she added the flower bed. Not blooming, not yet, just soft mounds of soil and the curve of a single sprout. Underneath the drawing, she wrote, "The hounds did not harm us. They watched us plant instead." It was a strange sentence, one that made sense only in the context of everything that had come before. To those outside the fence, it might seem like poetry or nonsense, but to those who had lived it, it was pure fact. She folded the letter twice, then again, tucking it into the inner pocket of her coat. She did not know if it would reach home. She did not even know if home still stood. But it was a record, a declaration, a contradiction. In Tokyo, months later, that letter would arrive, intercepted and copied by the remnants of imperial intelligence. By then, Haruka had been released, processed, and lost to the confusion of post-war Japan, but her words remained. They were read with narrowed eyes by officers in windowless rooms. "The hounds did not harm us." That line troubled them. So did the sketch. A soldier's mind was meant to harden in captivity. A woman's loyalty was supposed to crack under enemy comfort. And yet here was evidence of softness, of care, of dignity granted, not stripped. Other letters followed, intercepted, or leaked. Each told the same kind of story in different voices. Food given without demand, blankets distributed in the cold, dogs that once snarled now napping near garden beds. These were not tales of humiliation. They were tales of dissonance, of enemy hands offering shelter, not harm. Inside the camp, the remaining women noticed the shift, not just in orders, but in tone. Their captors no longer loomed, they lingered. Conversations, once functional, turned human. A guard asked about a flower's progress. Another handed over a fresh pencil without being asked. The divide still existed, but it had thinned to something permeable. No one crossed it completely, but they stood close. When Haruka boarded the transport, she didn't wave, but she looked back just once. Her eyes landed on the dog, sprawled beneath a patch of shade, one paw twitching in his sleep. And beyond him, the edge of the garden, where a single yellow bloom had opened that morning. That was the last thing she saw of Camp Bartlett. And in Tokyo, years later, a man in uniform would look at her letter, then look at the sketch, and feel the quiet, unnerving weight of a truth too gentle to ignore. The enemy had not only survived, they had been shown mercy, and mercy in war could be far more dangerous than hatred. The ship groaned as it pulled into the shattered dock, its hull scarred by salt and time. The women stood on the deck, their canvas duffel bags slung low, eyes searching the horizon for something they could recognize. But the skyline of Japan was a stranger now, flattened rooftops, smokeless chimneys, cranes that reached toward ruins rather than sky. No flags, no families, just wind, ash, and the low creak of ropes being tightened against wood. There were no dogs waiting, no watchful eyes or gentle tails swaying at the edge of the crowd, no fence, no garden, only silence. The women stepped off one by one, their boots touching Japanese soil for the first time in years, but it didn't feel like home. It felt like a dream being remembered by someone else. Their country had lost the war, but in this moment it felt like it had also lost its warmth. Streets were gutted, rice was rationed, and the people who passed them in the alleys looked away quickly, as if unsure whether to salute or scorn. For many of the women, it was not the return they had imagined. Some had replayed this moment in their minds during every Texas sunrise, how they'd fall to their knees and kiss the dirt, how their parents would come running. But the war had taken more than years. It had taken context. In the ruins, there were no parades, just lines for food and whispers about shame. They tried to explain, some of them, to siblings, to old teachers, to hollow-eyed uncles who had seen Tokyo burn. "They fed us," one woman said. "We planted things," said another, but their words landed strangely, like rumors spoken underwater. "The Americans?" the listeners would reply, brows knitting. "You mean the enemy?" And the women would nod slowly, unsure whether to correct the label or surrender to it. What they couldn't say, what had no translation, was the way silence had protected them more than orders ever had. How a circle of women standing still could feel more powerful than 1,000 marching soldiers. How dogs, bred for violence, had lain down beside them like companions. Instead, they held the memories privately, like smuggled photographs. A bean sprout pushing through dry Texas soil, a letter folded into a coat pocket, a brindle hound rolling onto his back with no fear. Years passed. Haruka, now older, walked the streets of Tokyo with slower steps. Life had resumed, but it hadn't returned. It had evolved. Storefronts gleamed, radios played jazz. But inside, something quiet had hardened. People didn't speak of the war unless forced. Captivity was mentioned only in euphemism. "Away," they would say. She was away during that time. On one gray afternoon, as Haruka rounded a corner near a noodle shop, she spotted a stray dog curled near a stoop, thin, dusty, watching without watching. Something in her paused. She knelt, careful not to spook it, and whispered a word she hadn't spoken in years. Not in this language, not on this soil. "Good boy." The dog's ears flicked. It didn't move otherwise, but the words felt like a key sliding into a long unopened lock. She stood and walked on. No one noticed. But inside her the story continued, a circle of women, a field of dirt, a growl that turned into breath. These were not victories. They were not even confessions. They were fragments of survival, of contradiction, of truth too simple to weaponize. If this story moved you, please like the video and comment where you're watching from. Every voice matters in keeping these forgotten archives alive.